Right, one of the things also.
I think we'll go ahead and start as usual. We'll have people drifting in, but don't want to make our Zoom people wait too long, so we'll go ahead. Suppose you picked up a book and you opened it up and you started reading, and it said, the first couple of lines on the page were, "Take a cup of confidence and add a pinch of sunshine." By the way, I just made that up. And thing is, you thought that it was a book of recipes. You're gonna make lunch, you're looking for something to fix for lunch. You can get very confused because you can think, okay, mustard I have, onions I have, but how do you take a cup of confidence and add a pinch of sunshine? And your problem is you picked up a book of poems, but you thought you were picking up a recipe book, okay? So you go back to your library and you pull another book down and you open it up and it says, "Take a large tomato and add a pinch of salt." But you're still confused because you thought that it was a book of poetry. And you couldn't figure out what the symbolic meaning of tomato was and what the symbolic meaning of a pinch of salt was. And in neither case did you get anything at all out of your reading. You just wasted all morning. You didn't get lunch made and you didn't enjoy the aesthetic qualities of a great poem. Or let me give you one third example. Suppose you pick up this book and you think that it's the script to a play, all right? And let's just say that you're an actor and you've been given this, that you've been told, we're going to send you the script of this new play, see what you think of it. So you pick up this book and you open it up and it's got this long list of names. And you turn the next page and the list just goes on, and you turn the next, and for 100 pages, it's just name after name after name. And you think, boy, this play is very short, but the cast of characters is really long. And then you realize that it's a telephone book. I don't know if you all remember telephone books, but we used to have those, you know. In all three cases, your problem was what I call genre confusion. You don't realize, you know that it's a book, but because you don't know what kind of book it is, you're completely confused by what you read in it. And some of you have heard me say this before, that I think one of the biggest problems that people have, they've always had it, they really have it in the modern world. The biggest problem that people have in reading the Bible is genre confusion. They read it not knowing what kind of literature they're reading. They're like the person who thinks they're reading a recipe when they're really reading a poem, or who think they're reading a poem when they're really reading a recipe. And so when people pick up a Bible and start reading, I think, I don't know if this is a good generalization to make or not, but I think when most people pick up the Bible and start reading, they think they're reading a straightforward historical account of something. Like like in the old days of journalism, I have to put it that way. When you used to read the newspaper and you read an article, it was just a straightforward statement of what happened yesterday. Kind of hard to find that anymore, even in the field of journalism, but it used to be like that. And I think people often pick up the Bible and start reading it thinking that that's what they're doing. And I'll just have to say, one of the things we may get out of this class is that that's not showing a lot of respect for the document you're reading. You know, to try to turn it into something that it's not Not to mention that you're not going to understand what it's talking about. You're not going to be understanding what the point is until you determine its genre. Just a word about what we'll be doing this semester, and then we get to sort of introducing. I'm here by myself this morning. Fallon's going to be co-teaching with me this semester, so we're going to have a fusion of the generations in the most dramatic kind of way. We'll see how this goes. She and I have promised we will never come to blows, but she has to be meeting with new students down in the chapel this morning. That's why she's not with us this morning. But generally, the format that we will use is each Sunday we're going to introduce a biblical genre, a type of literature that you find in the Bible. And I'm going to talk about that genre and how that functioned in the ancient world and how you would understand something written in that, if it's poetry or if it's a legal document or if it's a historical document or whatever it might be. And then Fallon is going to take 2 or 3 passages from the Bible that are written in that genre. And then she's going to talk about, or perhaps lead a discussion about, given the genre, how do we interpret what this passage means? What do we get out of it? Okay. So that's kind of the way we'll organize it. And next week, we're going to give all the members of the class, I think we are, a sheet in which we'll tell you what all the genres are we're going to talk about and what the passages are, so that you can look at them ahead of time if you want to. We have some members of this class, by the way, through the years I've learned that by at least Tuesday or Wednesday, I have to be prepared to tell them what passage we're going to be studying next Sunday, because they're going to contact me and ask me what it is. So we're going to anticipate that, give this to everybody ahead of time, so you'll know what these are. I think you'll find this fun, and I don't know, I was thinking while in the parking lot, I think I taught my first Sunday school class in a kind of organized way in the year 1960. So what would that be? 4 years. Yeah, so I've been doing this for quite a while. I don't think I've ever done this before. So I'm going to have to just sort of stay ahead of the class by a week or two so that we can do this. And of course, I'll depend on Fallon to do the same thing. So, genre confusion. What is a genre? Well, it's one of these nice French words, first place, that make you sound sophisticated. I looked up, I think I looked at my main source of all information nowadays, Wikipedia, and it said that a genre is a category of composition characterized by similarities in form, style, or subject matter. I prefer to say a genre is something like poem, a novel, a news report, a telephone book, a traffic ticket, a science fiction story. These are all genres. These are types. They all have this in common. You can write them on a page, put a cover on them, and call them a book. But they're very different from each other, and they require different kind of interpretation. Now, so that's what a genre is. Now, what is a Bible? Since we'll be talking about the genres of biblical interpretation. Well, here's one. I remember, by the way, when this was this Bible, there were some people who were very upset by this Bible. And they didn't have to open it to get upset. You know what they were first upset about? Wrong color. Wrong color. Everybody knows that Bibles are black. Yeah. And by the way, the cover has to be all leather. Usually has to have gold around here. Sometimes a little thumb thing so you can find what part you want. Modern people have a very strong sense of what a Bible is. It always comes as a shock to people to realize that through most of the history of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, people did not have this. This is a relatively modern development. One of the things I want to do with you this morning is talk about how we got to the point of calling this a Bible. Now, the word Bible itself is usually thought of as just being a synonym of the word book. So people say the book. I know my father always referred to the Bible as the book. He would say, the book says, and we always knew what he meant by that. And a lot of people have done that down through history. The Bible is the book. It's the sort of pinnacle of books. And there is such a thing in fact, in our modern world, we almost always mean, when we use the word book, we mean a physical object. This is a book. And libraries are full of books. It's a thing, it has a cover on it, it has sheets of paper on the inside, it has things written on them and so on. I didn't look that up in Wikipedia, so that's my own definition. But anyway, actually, through most of human history, when people wrote things down, they wrote them on a scroll, you know. I used to have a little scroll I used to illustrate, but you know what a scroll is. You just take the sheet of paper or papyrus or leather or whatever it was, and you rolled it up. And so if you went to an ancient library, like this magnificent library that was in ancient Alexandria, they just have sort of shelves and they have these scrolls rolled up and they just stuff them back in there, kind of file them as a scroll. You know, it's kind of like I often thought, you know, human beings were around for how many centuries before somebody invented the wheel, and you think, why didn't they? That's so simple. Why didn't somebody figure it out? I've always kind of thought that about books. You know, why do people for hundreds of thousands of years really have these rolled up things where you had to unroll and you couldn't? It's very hard to find where in it the passage was you wanted to read, and you know, that sort of thing. So it was. You think, why didn't somebody think of this? There was a kind of an intermediate stage between what we today call a book and what ancient people called a book. I'll get to that in a minute, which was a scroll. There was a thing that's called a codex, C-O-D-E-X. And a codex looks like a book. For all practical purposes, it's always the same thing as a book. What somebody discovered was you could take your scroll and you could chop it up in pieces, and then you could stack the pieces up on one another. And then you could glue them together on the side, and you could flip through like that, and you could find things easier than you could if you unrolled it, you know. So it just made it easier to locate things. I found it interesting that when, you know, like in an ancient synagogue, they had the big scroll that had the Pentateuch on it, huge scroll. And you could never just look up, you know, and say, okay, today we're going to study, you know, Leviticus 14. And then you didn't have to roll this big scroll until you found Leviticus 5. That's not the way they did it. They took the scroll and they just gradually unrolled it. And the text for that day was whatever came next in the scroll. You know, there's this story in the Gospels where Jesus is going to comment that day in the synagogue. And it's in the passage for that day. Well, so that's just meant that's where the scroll was rolled to. And so they read that and they studied that and they just gradually went through the scroll like that. We don't do that anymore. We have the pages, which, by the way, enables us to skip over the parts that we don't understand or can't explain. So, and preachers have been doing that ever since, skipping over the hard parts. But that's just a snide little comment. Anyway, so we start with scrolls, we go to the codex, and eventually we have the book. The word book, by the way, it has a very complicated history, both in Latin and in Greek. It's mostly thought of as a Greek word, biblios, and it's actually named after a town. I wanted to show you, I've got a picture here of a coin. You know, I always like to show
You want me to bring it up?
A coin, yeah, let's take a look at that coin. This coin is from the Greek city. It's a coastal city on the Mediterranean, I think it's in modern Lebanon. And it was called Byblos. We spell it now Byblos, Byblos. And on this coin, you can, if you know Greek letters and you look real carefully, you may be actually able to see the word Byblos on this coin. I think the word, I can't see the coin from where I'm sitting here, but I think it says something like Byblos the Holy, which is the way ancient cities would describe themselves if they had a temple there, Holy Byblos. The reason the word Byblos got tied to a book is because Byblos was a port city where they shipped out papyrus. Papyrus is what they used to make paper, ancient paper made out of the papyrus plant. So since it came from Byblos, they would say that stuff from Byblos. And then when they made codexes out of it, they began to call those things Bibles or books. So that's where we got the word. But actually, the Bible is not, this Bible, this what I'm looking at here, is the book maybe in a cultural sense, but it's actually a bunch of books. And that's the first thing you've got to understand about the Bible. The Bible is not a book in the sense that you can start at the beginning of it and like you were reading one of these big long 900-page novels. You just can't do that with the Bible. People, I always worry about people will say, you know what I'm going to do this year? I'm going to start in Genesis and I'm going to read the Bible through. And I always think to myself, I don't say anything, but I think to myself, boy, I hope you know what you're doing. Because unless you understand that what the Bible is, I'll come to this in a minute, that the Bible is an anthology of books. It is not a book. And if you try to read it like a book, you're going to really get confused. You're going to start saying things like, I think I read this once before. Hey, now this is the third time it said the same thing. You know, you're going to have things like that. And then you're going to think, well, where did the story go? Mm-hmm. And where am I now in history? And am I supposed to take this literally? You know, all the things and I didn't know that was in here. All the things that we get when we start reading through like that. It's okay to read the Bible through like that. But just got to understand that the genres are changing. Every time you go to a new book, and that makes me say that in ancient times, the word book was not used of a physical object. It could be, but what it basically meant was it is a writing. When you write anything down, you have created a book. By the way, if it was just half a page, it would still be a book. And in the act of writing something on it, you even could write it on stone and it'd still be called a book. It was writing something down on something else made that thing a book. There is one place I know in the Bible where it actually describes this process about one of the books in the Bible, by the way. I don't know if you've ever noticed this passage. It's in Jeremiah 36. And let me just read you 3 or 4 verses here. I think you find this very interesting. In the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Take a scroll, this is the word of the Lord coming, take a scroll and write on it all the words I have spoken to you concerning Israel, Judah, and all the other nations from the time I began speaking to you in the reign of Josiah till now. Perhaps when the people of Judah hear about every disaster I plan to inflict on them, they will each turn from their wicked ways. Then will I forgive their wickedness and their sin. So Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and while Jeremiah dictated all the words the Lord had spoken to him, Baruch wrote them on a scroll. So there you have the actual record of at least one book in the Bible, the book of Jeremiah, the prophecies of Jeremiah. And the book explains exactly how it got here. I find it interesting, by the way, that Jeremiah, like Paul, by the way, had a secretary and dictated. So the Lord told Jeremiah, and Jeremiah told Baruch, and Baruch wrote it down on a scroll, and there you got the book of Jeremiah. Now, I presume that something similar to that is the way the Bible was written. That's the only, there may have been different ways, and I think, for example, my own opinion is Luke did research very much like you scholars do research that eventually you hope's going to get you promoted. That he studied the various documents and so on, because he said he did. So we have a few clues, about how this was done, but this is the sort of typical way. Also, the word book in ancient times can be used to mean what we would today call a chapter in a larger book. For example, if you pick up the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, you'll find it'll say book 1, book 2, book 3, but like we would say chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter. So the word book in ancient times sometimes also meant simply a chapter. Plato, I think, is divided. I don't know that Plato and Josephus actually did those divisions, but later on, librarians did that. And by the way, that's why the Bible is divided into chapters. The writers did not divide it into chapters. This is editorial work done by librarians later so that we can find things in an easier way. So now the Bible then is a collection of books. It's a gathering of books into one place. And the word we usually use for that is an anthology. I looked up, here we go with Wikipedia again. And so a lot of people do this and don't admit it. I always admit it. The term anthology typically categorizes collections of shorter works by different authors, each featuring various casts of characters and settings, and usually collected into a single volume for publication. Well, that describes exactly what we've got when we've got the Bible. Different authors, different casts of characters, different types of literature, that is, different genres. By the way, I don't know if this means anything except it's just interesting. The word anthology is a very interesting word because it's got two parts, and the first part of it is anthos, and that in ancient Greek means a flower. And then logios, which is just way too complicated to try to explain what that word means, but it means all kinds of different things. But it means a bouquet of flowers, a collection of flowers. And it started way back in Greek times when somebody gathered a bunch of poems together, and in a very poetic way, they called it a bouquet of flowers, an anthology. And the word stuck. So now whenever we have collections of various books put into one book, we call those an anthology, a bouquet of flowers. Now, the way they're organized, I remember when I was a kid, every year we had a gospel meeting. Some of y'all remember these. It was sometimes 2 weeks, 3 weeks. A preacher came from out of town and he would preach every night. Can you believe that? We went to church every single night, 2 or 3 weeks in a row. And Kevin. Sorry. I think that was a snide remark.
That was all in all sincerity.
But of course, the kids All the kids had to come too, you know, we didn't have special class or anything. We came to that. And, but they did sometimes, the visiting preacher, before they had the sermon, they would have all the kids sit on the front row and he had this chart. And one of the things the visiting preacher would teach the kids is the different sections of the Bible. So, you know, there's the wisdom literature, there's the prophets, and there's the historical books, and there's the law, you know, and they have them all organized there. Now that looked a little bit like genre, like they were teaching us different genre of the Bible. And they were in a way, but it's very misleading. We'll be coming back to this, I think, over and over in this class. Because just because a book is in the category of the prophets does not mean that a certain passage is prophetic. It may be poetic. It may be historical. You gotta determine which of these genres it is, even though it may be in the section that we call the prophetic section. Now, the Bible, the traditional Bibles that people have used for the last several hundred years were actually 3 anthologies. They were 3 collections. There was what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. There was what we call the New Testament or the New Covenant or the Christian scriptures. What was the third one, you know?
Apocrypha.
The Apocrypha. Now, if you've always been a Protestant, you don't know that Bibles for hundreds and hundreds of years had a section in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. These were books, by the way, that were written during the period after the Old Testament, before the New Testament. And they're still in Roman Catholic Bibles to today. They are in some of the ancient Bibles as well. We won't get into all that right now. But there were actually 3 anthologies. There was the Old Testament, or the Jewish scriptures. There was the Apocrypha. Can anybody name me a book that's in the Apocrypha?
Maccabees.
First and Second Maccabees. Anybody know any others?
Judith, is Judith in
Mm,
there? No?
I don't think so. I can't name them either. So, you shouldn't ask questions you don't know the answer to.
Bell and the Dragon. Right?
Bell and the Dragon, I think, is in there. Yeah. It's actually a part of an addition to the book of Daniel that's there, that's not in our Old Testament. Anyway, this is we maybe you're going astray here, other than just to say that there were these 3 anthologies. We can talk later about why Protestant Bibles don't have those in there. That's a whole nother question. But anyway, let's just talk a little bit about the way the Old Testament was organized. In Jesus' day, the Old Testament was not organized exactly the same way as it is in our Bibles today. In fact, I'm not sure that they ever had a scroll that had all of the books of the Old Testament in it. It would have been gigantic. They had a scroll that had all the books of the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Torah, those 5 books were in a scroll. And they had another scroll for the prophets. And they put the longer prophet books at the beginning of it and the smaller ones at the end, sort of filling in the blank spaces and so on. Again, I won't get into all of that, just to say that we do know the first time I know of the Old Testament being all gathered together like one anthology was when one of the successors of Alexander the Great, one of the emperors, Greek emperors, decided that the Old Testament should be translated into Greek. You know, it was in Hebrew, and he thought it was a great book, and he wanted a copy in the library at Alexandria, but he needed for it to be in Hebrew. And so he gathered, the tradition said, 70 of the greatest Jewish scholars of the day. And he told them to translate their scriptures into Greek. And so it's called the Septuagint, the translation of the 70. And that may be the first time when all the Jewish scriptures were gathered together into one volume. This was done for that library. But it's very interesting that almost all New Testament writers, when they quote from the Old Testament. Paul does this all the time. They don't quote from the Hebrew, even though they could read Hebrew. Paul could read Hebrew, but he quotes from the Septuagint. The Septuagint became the Bible of the ancient world and the Bible of the earliest Christians. Now, it had a few books in it that are not in our Old Testament. And those are the ones that become the Apocrypha. But again, I don't want to spend too much time on that. There's a passage in Luke that I find fascinating. Luke chapter 24, verse 44. Jesus is speaking and he says, he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." That gives you a clue as to how the Old Testament was organized in Jesus' day. There were 3 volumes. There was the Torah, or the law of Moses, probably 1 scroll. There were the prophets, probably another scroll, and the Psalms, probably the 3rd scroll. Now we do it differently, somewhat differently. Well, it's the same content. But what I was taught on the front row at the gospel meeting back in Missouri was, there's the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses. There are the books of history. What would be an example of one of the books of history? No, that's one of the Pentateuch. Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Numbers.
Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel.
Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. I was today, we're not gonna have enough time. I was gonna have us to do the thing where you say the books. I was even thinking about bringing a chart with my little pointer and have everybody do Genesis, because we did that. I could still do most of them. I still get a little bit mixed up. I haven't tried doing the minor prophets recently. Hosea, Amos.
Joel,
Amos, Obadiah, Joel, Micah. Yeah. So anyway, that's becoming a lost art, by the way, to be able to do that. But at any rate, we had the Pentateuch, then we had the books of history. Then we have the books of wisdom and poetry. Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. And then we have the prophets, and they're divided not chronologically, but by how long they are, how long the book is. The longer ones first. So we call those the major prophets, just meaning they're longer, not that they're more important. And then the minor prophets. Now, I want to make another point to you, or make it again. Each book may be made up of several genres, okay? So you can be reading a historical book, say Judges, the book of Judges, which is appears to be a book of historical record of these leaders of the people of Israel before they had kings. They just call these guys judges. But the smack in the middle of that, and I'm not sure whether this is one of the passages that Fallon will be talking about later, but there is this, sometimes people think it's the oldest thing in the Bible, and maybe the oldest poem that still exists in literature today, and it's called the Song of Deborah. You know what I'm talking about? The Song of Deborah. It's this wonderful thing about how Deborah the woman who is the judge over Israel. Whatever happened to the Bible being the source of patriarchal male rule. Anyway, Deborah is the ruler over the people of Israel, and she destroys the king that's trying to destroy the people of Israel. And this beautiful poem, it's gruesome, but it's a beautiful poem. It's written, a very, very ancient piece of literature, needs to be read as a poem, okay? The poem. And it's right in the middle of what we would call the historical section of the Old Testament. So be careful. That thing that we did on the chart was good for some things, but it also maybe left a wrong impression when it comes to the genre. Now, the New Testament. The New Testament is a little more complex. Here's another thing, sometimes comes as a shock to people. It's highly unlikely that any church during the New Testament period, maybe even through the second century, ever had all of the books at its disposal that we have in the New Testament. It's pretty unlikely. They were certainly not gathered together into an anthology, into one volume yet. Paul gives us some insight when he will say, now, I wrote a letter to the church at such and such place. And I told them to send that to you, and you all read it, and you send the one I sent to you to them. So the epistle, certainly an epistle is a genre, right? An epistle is a type of literature, it's a letter. And these letters were passed around like that from one church to the other. The Gospels are more complex. It's probably true that in some geographical locations, people mostly had the Gospel of John. In some other locations, they mostly had Luke and Acts, and others they mostly had Mark. In other words, it was not, you couldn't count on that the congregation that you attended had Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, and so on. It isn't that they were lacking the gospel. They had that. They had the life and teaching of Jesus. But they did not have what we would call the New Testament, all 27 books. You don't really get that gathering together until, oddly enough, it happens because of the government too. Just like the Old Testament got gathered together because of a Syrian pagan king saying, I want you to gather this whole thing together. The New Testament got gathered together because Constantine, the Roman emperor in the 4th century, said, we need to have all of this in one place. And I want every church to have exactly the same one. This doesn't sound like a king, sound like a central government, you know. Central government's always like for everybody to do everything exactly the same way. This has happened all through human history. This is nothing new. So Constantine said, I want all the churches to have the same Bible. So he got all of the scholars. Now, he didn't pretend to know which books ought to be there, but he got all the scholars together and he said, now I want you to settle this question. Not which books would you like to have? A lot of people misunderstand this. I see this on the internet, people getting on there and saying, oh, there wasn't even a New Testament until the 4th century. And then that just because some king decided what it was going to be, or some council decided what books would be in the New Testament. Not true. What he did was he asked the scholars and the theologians of the church in his day, what books carry with them apostolic authority? Jesus gave to his apostles the task of giving us the gospel. Which books can be traced back to the teaching of the apostles? That was the issue. And if you go back and read all of the discussion that the scholars had in that day, that's what they talked about. It wasn't, I like this book, or I don't like that one. Now, we might, and modern scholars sometimes still argue a little bit about some of their conclusions. It's not an entirely closed question. But this is what they were trying to do. They were trying to say, no, which books can we count on as going back and carrying with them the authority of the apostles? And if they don't carry that, but if they're a very old book and belong to very early Christians, those we're going to call the Apocrypha, the Christian Apocrypha. Just like they're books that you tag on to the end of the Old Testament that really don't have the same authority. They're books that you tag on to the New Testament that don't have either. You may have heard of some of these. There's, the Gospel of James. There's the Epistle of Barnabas. There are books like this. But the earliest Christians knew that these, even though they had biblical names on them, they didn't really go back to biblical people. They didn't go back to the apostles. But they were honored as being books with great wisdom in them and so on. And you can still find those books today and read them. They're not secret, they're not banned. I see words like this, they banned these books, or they try to keep them secret from us. This is all conspiracy stuff. So the church councils did not create the New Testament. They did affirm which books came from the apostles or had apostolic authority. Maybe didn't come directly from the apostles. Constantine, by the way, ordered that 50 copies of the Bible be made, and that's where we started kind of doing this. Codex Sinaiticus, if you're ever in London, go over to the British Library, you just could walk in free and just walk in and just go in there and go to the right, and there's this room in there, and there it is. Codex Sinaiticus. Let's show the picture of it.
1 second, we just had a camera failure.
Oh, okay. Now the British got it. The British bought this from the Russians.
Okay,
Russians decided they didn't believe the Bible. This is back in communist days,
right, it's on.
previous communist days. They decided the Bible was worthless, so they sold it to the British for £100,000. So that's why the British have this Bible. And it's got a more complicated story to it than that, but I won't go into it. But anyway, some people think this is one of the 50 copies. We don't know for sure, but maybe it was from the 4th century. Anyway, it's one of the oldest, where you just got the whole thing put together in such a way that it looks like our Bible today. But this is 400 years into Christianity. Christianity has been around a long time before you get to this point. Now, I have one other thing I want to do before we quit today. Let's look at a list of some of the genres that occur in the Bible. And we'll take one of these. I won't promise we get around to all of them, and we may add some as we go along. But here are some of the genres that we'll look at and talk about. Once you can figure out what genre you're reading, how should that affect how you understand what it's trying to tell you? Okay.
Do you want me to put them up?
Yeah, let's look at them. And I'll just read through the list and I'm not going to define them because that's what we'll be doing in the class. But there's the historical epic, which is what most people think that's all the Bible is one long historical epic. They read it all like that. There's the novella, the little short novel. Anybody know what an example of that might be? There are two of them, both have women's names. Ruth and Esther.
Esther.
There's a gospel, which is a type of literature within itself. There's a parable. They're short. We don't have a book that's a parable. We have parables in the books. There's a narrative where somebody is doing pretty much what a reporter would do. I went and I saw them doing this, and this is what happened, and this is who said what. There is the poetic story, which is not the same. A poetic story is like an epic. It tells the story. We have these great poems in English literature that tell, I think, about Paradise Lost. It's a poem, but it tells the story of the creation of Adam and Eve and so on. It's not meant to be read as history, but it is meant to be read as a significant explanation of why humans are here and why they're like what they are. So that's what I'm calling the poetic story. And then there's just the flat out poem. The book of Psalms has got a lot of them, but there are a lot more poems in the Bible, including some of the New Testament. Then there's wisdom literature, things like Proverbs. A stitch in time saves 9. There's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. That's not the Bible, that's Ben Franklin, but then there's law. We want to really spend some time on this because there's some laws in the Bible you wouldn't believe. Literally, you wouldn't believe. And we got to talk about, are we supposed to keep those laws or not? Very important to know what to do when you're reading laws in the Bible. Then there's prophecy. Now, we don't have major prophecy and minor prophecy. We have books we call major prophecy and minor, but prophecy is a type of literature. It's a genre. Then we have epistles or letters, okay? Some of them really look like letters where it just says, dear so-and-so, and it ends by saying, love so-and-so. You can tell that's a letter. Some of them are a little more difficult. And then we have something called an apocalypse. An apocalypse is a certain way of writing, and it's full of dragons and pearly gates and things like that. And you really have to know what you're doing when you read it, or you'll come up with some of the stuff I hear on TV. Bizarre interpretations of apocalypses because the person that is talking about it does not understand what an apocalypse is. So those are some of the categories that we'll look at and some of the passages that we'll give you next week. Some of the passages that are examples of these. Anybody have I guess we got about 2 minutes. Anybody have a question or comment you'd like to make?
Zoom can do this too.
Yeah, anybody on
You
Zoom?
said
as well?
something,
Yeah.
and while when I was reading the Quran, Muhammad said it in the Quran, and the Surah 52 that if you don't understand what I'm saying or what I'm teaching you or what I'm writing, go back to the people of the book.
Yes, yes. Well, and Bible,
So my conclusion was that it was the Jewish book.
yeah.
It was either the Torah or either one of these books.
And in fact, Muhammad had great respect for the books. And that phrase, the people of the book, was very, very important. By the way, again, this will be getting way off what we're going to try to do this time, but the Quran is very interesting too, to try to study and understand from the point of view of genre. It has all of the surahs, or sort of what we might call chapters, but they're not all the same genre either. That's another very interesting study, but we can't, next thing you know, we're gonna be doing the Bhagavad Gita. So we're gonna stick with the Bible in this class.
And actually, the Quran, if you read the Quran from the early stage from the beginning, most of the things in the Quran is that it's like from the Torah, from the Jewish, from the book of the law. You pass on a lot of things in the Quran from the book of the law, from the Torah, from the prophecy. It is these new versions have been added that are new scholars just saying another crap, but the original Torah is all, the original Torah is all the Bible, all the Torah.
Yeah, there's a great influence, because that was anyway, I'd love to get into all of that, but we do have to quit today. So I think we stay in here, even though we're having church today in a different place. Am I right about that?
Well,
I think we meet for the worship's gonna be in Elkins
Yeah,
this week, but starting next week, is that right?
I think it's 3 weeks.
3 weeks
It is
here.
my understanding, it is
Okay,
in Elkins, but
And then it goes back down there. But this sticks, right?
Yeah,
You can
this is
count on
our-
us, folks. We're all in the same place. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.